Hey guys, today we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting various systems of government. And so this set of notes are the first in our semester on US government. And so we're going to talk about some various systems of government that exist around the world. But more importantly, we're going to talk about the type of government that exists right here at home in the United States. And so this video, as we go through these notes and these slides, if at any time you need to stop and pause, if there's a concept or whatever, you need to rewind, this will make it where you can go back and forth, you can stop, you can take notes, and you can really work through these notes at your pace. Okay, so let's get so first we're going to talk about how governments differ in geographic distribution of power, particularly unitary, confederal, and federal types of government. So we're going to talk about how the government distributes or loans out its power, and how that power, there's power within the central government, and how that power is divided amongst the entire country. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a unitary type of government. This is a government that has a centralized government. All the powers are held by one single central agency or government, and then the central government creates local units, sometimes local governments, could be called states. And these local units only have powers that the central government gives them. Now, most of the governments in the world are unitary. That means that most have a centralized government, and then they give powers to local governments to handle things at the local level. But one example of a centralized government is Great Britain, as you see the arrow pointing to it. Now, Great Britain uses a parliamentary system, but the central organization, Parliament, holds all the government's power. But what Parliament does is it gives powers to the local governments to relieve some of the burdens from Parliament. I mean, there's no way that a national government can take care of things at the local level. There's just too many people, and it's just too big of a job. So that's what we call a unitary government. You get a centralized government where the power is held by one central agency. Now, a federal government is the next type of government that we're going to talk about. And this is one in which the powers of the government are divided between a central government or national government and several lower levels of government. This is the type of government we have here in the United States. So if you remember back in U.S. history, the 10th Amendment, it talks about that the power that is delegated to the states. And so in a federal government, the power within the country is shared between the federal or national government and state governments. And so, like just as we just said, the central national government has certain powers, and the 50 states have other powers. And now the United States Constitution, the rule of law, and our set of rules that we use to govern our country, that really kind of outlines and it gives what that division of powers are. Now, there is a term that I want to make sure that you understand, that you associate with the federal type of government, the type of government that we have in the United States. That's called federalism. And once again, that's where the power within the country is divided between the federal government and the state and local governments. Now, there are some other countries around the world that have federal governments. One of them is Australia. Another is Germany. Another is our neighbors to the south, Mexico. Another country that has a federal government is the country of India. And then another is our neighbor to the north, Canada. All of these countries, and many others, but these countries have federal governments. Again, a national government where the power is distributed between a national government and local or state government. Another type of government is called a confederate government. And this is an alliance or a union of independent states. Now, this is where the confederate government, the government is created, that's created from this collection of independent states, only handles matters that the independent states assign to it. This is very similar to what we had before we adopted the Constitution here in the United States under the Articles of Confederation. There were a number of independent states, and the only powers that the federal government had, or the central government, were the powers that the states gave to it. And so now a confederate government, the one that we're talking about here, is usually formed for purposes of national defense and trade. So it allows for business to be done easier between the countries that are a part of this confederate government. Now, a great example of a confederate government is the European Union. Prior to the European Union being formed, all of the European countries had their own separate currency or money. Each had a different exchange rate and each was valued different, and it made it tougher to do business. When the countries that are a part of the European Union joined the European Union, they went to a one common currency called the euro, and it made it very easy to do business between the various countries within the European Union. So that's a confederate type of government. Again, an alliance of independent states. So now we're going to talk about how some forms of government differ in their level of citizen participation. This is really how much control or power that we have as citizens within these types of governments. We're going to talk about authoritarian types of governments, and specifically autocracies and oligarchies, and we're going to talk about democratic forms of government. But first, we're going to talk about authoritarian forms of government. Now, one thing to remember that an authoritarian form of government is often referred to as a dictatorship. Now, as soon as we say that word, there's a couple of dictators that come to mind, a couple of countries that come to mind, and we'll look at some of those, couple of examples here in just a minute. But the first type of authoritarian form of government that we're going to talk about is called an autocracy. Do you know what an autocracy is? An autocracy is a government in which one person holds unlimited political power. Once again, when you put dictatorship with an autocracy, we can start to think about some historical leaders and historical dictators that had unlimited political power. The other type of authoritarian government is called an oligarchy. Now, you got to think back from world history. What is an oligarchy? Now, an oligarchy is a government in which the power is held by a small, often self-appointed elite. In other words, a small group of people, usually a small number of individuals or families or groups, but it's a very small number of individuals that have all of the power in the country. So those are two types of authoritarian types of governments. Now, one thing to remember, all dictatorships are authoritarian, just like we said earlier. So let's look at some examples, and these should be very obvious. One, Hitler in Nazi Germany. Another dictator was Mussolini in Italy. If you remember back from U.S. history and world history, they were part of the Axis powers in World War II. Now, an authoritarian government that is happening right now, present day, is in North Korea. That is a picture of Kim Jong-un. So he is a dictator. So all those three are just examples of dictatorships and authoritarian types of governments. If you want to break out your phone, this is a QR code that if you scan it with your barcode reader or QR reader, it'll take you to a website that will show different authoritarian governments around the world in countries that are under authoritarian rule. You'll see that some countries are free, some countries are partly free, and some countries are under authoritarian rule. And you can scroll over it and see which countries fall under that authoritarian type of government. Now, the next form we're going to talk about are democratic or democracies. What is a democracy? Do you remember? Now, democracy is where the supreme power rests with the people. This is a government that is conducted only with the consent of the people. In other words, the people within the country give the government permission or their consent to govern them. In a democratic form of government, citizens participate in elections and choose who will represent them. So this is that part where, one, we choose who will represent us and who will make the laws for us. But again, in a democracy, the government governs at the consent of the people. In other words, the people give permission for the government to govern. So here's another QR code. Scan this thing and it will take you, and you will be able to see countries around the world that are under democratic forms of government. If you don't have a QR reader, you can go to this URL or this website below, and it'll show you those that are democracies. Now, very quickly, we're going to look at how the executives differ in presidential and parliamentary systems of government. Now, when we think about a CEO, and we think about a country, who is the CEO of the United States? You're exactly right. It's the President of the United States. Just like a company, the President of the United States is the CEO of our country. He handles the day-to-day business of our country. So looking at this image in this chart, this will give you an idea of the difference between a presidential relationship or a presidential style of government and a parliamentary style of government. So the presidential, this is how the president is elected in a presidential relationship. The voters actually elect the president or the chief executive. Do you guys remember how that happens? You're exactly right. It happens through the electoral college. And so the way that the president is elected, we go to the polls and vote. The candidate who wins the majority of the popular vote in a particular state will then, the electors of that state will then be given to that candidate. And whichever presidential candidate reaches 270 electoral votes is then elected president of the United States. But the important thing to remember here is that in a presidential relationship style of government, the president is chosen by the voters. Now, in a parliamentary relationship, the voters actually elect the legislature, but it's the legislature that then chooses who the chief executive is. A great example of this is Parliament and Great Britain. So the voters within the country of Great Britain, they will elect those members who will go to Parliament and a part of that legislature. But the people in Great Britain don't choose their prime minister. The prime minister or the chief executive is chosen by Parliament. So those are the two different types, and then to give you a contrasting view of presidential and parliamentary governments, you will need to remember those different types. The next thing is we're going to look at and differentiate between a direct democracy and a representative democracy or republic. Okay? Now, a direct democracy. Do you remember, think back world history. Well, what is a direct democracy? Yes, a direct democracy is where the will of the people is translated into public policy directly through mass meetings. This is like a town hall. If you remember ancient Greece, everyone would get together and that they would all do the business. And so they would vote on all of the laws and everybody would have a say-so. So imagine today if the United States did all of their lawmaking by direct democracy. Think about where everybody in the country would all come together and vote on everything. Yeah, it's kind of hard to think about that because it doesn't happen. I mean, direct democracies do not exist at the national level in really any countries around the world today. Now, direct democracy still exists and is still used in local, maybe towns and things like that, where they can sit, whereas a smaller group of people in a smaller area can actually make the laws for that particular area. But nowhere does direct democracy rule at the national level. And of course, why? Why do you think that's so? Yeah, we just said it. There's no way that the federal government of the United States could make all the laws for every city and every state and every county and every town in the country. It just would be impossible to do. So the next type of democracy is a representative democracy. So what is a representative democracy? You're exactly right. This is where representatives are chosen through elections. So in other words, the people choose a small number of representatives to then go and represent them in government. This is the type of government and democracy that we have in the United States. You will see visions here, the pictures. You have the United States Senate. Here you see my cursor, and then the United States House of Representatives. We have a Senate and a House of Representatives at the national level as well as at the state levels. And so these members of Congress, and we'll talk more about them in the coming weeks, but these members of Congress or the legislative branch of government are chosen through votes. And every 2 years, we have elections to elect House of Representatives and some of the senators that are a part of the United States Senate. But the big thing to remember here is that the elected officials in a representative democracy and in a democracy itself, govern with the consent or the permission of the governed. You and I, the people who live in the country. In a democracy, we the people, give permission to the government to rule us or to govern. Now, a republic. So what is a republic? We've seen a direct democracy, we've seen a representative democracy. What is a republic? Well, that is where a republic has the sovereign power is held by those who are eligible to vote. See, while the political power is exercised by the representatives, in other words, the people that we elect, we as citizens or those who are eligible to vote really hold the power. So when we think about here in the United States and when we say our Pledge of Allegiance, right? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And so one thing to remember and is that, again, the government in a representative democracy, what we have in the United States, they are governed at the consent of us. So here's a question that I want you to think about, and here's one that I want you to be able to answer and discuss. Is that why in a republic is the power held by those who are eligible to vote? So think about that. Think about the forms of democracy. Think about the forms of government that we've talked about here over the last few minutes. And think about in a republic, why in a republic is the power held by those who are eligible to vote. All right, well, that will do for this set as we compare and contrast various systems of government. Again, if you have any questions, you can certainly email me. But if you need to rewind and go back, if there's something you missed, especially as you're thinking about that question about why in a republic the power rests with those who are eligible to vote, you can certainly rewind it, go back and review. So I hope this has helped. I look forward to seeing you on campus.